Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started. My name is Samantha Blake. I am the program manager of the Women Legislators Lobby. Thank you for joining us today. And just for a quick background, the Women Legislators Lobby is a program of women's action for new directions. Works to build women's political power with a focus on advocating for security and peace with justice. And the Women Legislators Lobby is a national nonpartisan network of women state legislators who work together to influence federal policy and budget priorities. We are celebrating our 30th year this year, and we'll be having a national conference this fall. Most likely will be virtual, so keep your eyes open for that. And we have two upcoming webinars after this, one about the 1033 program next Thursday, and then one about the mechanics of an interview, which will be the week after with communications experts. So without further ado, I am going to pass, actually, one more thing. If you have any questions, drop them in the Q&A chat or raise your hand. And webinar recordings are only available for dues-paying WIL members through the membership portal, and you can check out our website to learn more about that. Now, without further ado, I'm going to pass this over to Lindsay.
Hi, I'm Lindsay Kashgarian, and I am the director of the National Priorities Project at the Institute for Policy Studies. And we're a project that works on making sure that our federal budget priorities prioritize peace, economic prosperity, and shared opportunity for all. And what that means is that we're a project that looks at how much we're spending in our federal budget on the Pentagon versus how much we're spending on all of the things that really keep us safe. And so what I'm going to do today is talk a bit about how the federal budget process works, how these decisions are made, and what are some of the things that we can do to shift spending from the Pentagon into things we really need. So for example, this year we've been living through COVID, and we can see that it doesn't take bombs or guns or fighter jets to keep us safe. It does take public health, and it takes an adequate safety net, and all of the things that really support us in our day-to-day lives and can actually save lives. So first, I want to acknowledge that the United States has a history of violence. It is built on violence, and that there is a white supremacist aspect to that violence. And of course, that comes up most obviously in our history with Native Americans and with slavery, and all the things from then until now. But it also comes up in our foreign policy, where we are more willing to engage in wars in the Middle East, where currently the big issue in support for hawks and support of Pentagon spending is making China out as an enemy. So, and both of those things really have racial components. There is a definite willingness to over-militarize for people who are not white. And the US has a long history of wars. This is just a partial list. There are others that are not here, but this is supposed to be a list of the US major wars, and it's not a perfect list, it's not complete. But what it shows is that the US, the longest the US has ever gone without a major war is 29 years. And that was between the Revolutionary War and the War of 1812. That was a long time ago. On average, the US has had a major war every 12 years. And this doesn't even include the Cold War. So we're a nation that's almost perpetually at war. One thing that has changed quite a bit is that since World War II, the size of our armed forces it blew up for World War II, and it never went back down to the levels that it was before that. And so ever since then, we have maintained very large armed forces and a very large budget to go with it. So bringing us to the present, here's our federal discretionary spending from fiscal year 2020. I'll just note quickly that this does not include the COVID relief bill. bills that passed in 2020. So this is just a picture of what our ordinary spending looks like. And as you can see, the biggest chunk of our federal discretionary budget is for the military. Now, this is the part of our budget that Congress works through their appropriations process every year. I'll talk some more about what that means, but it is the segment where Congress is deciding our priorities for each year. It doesn't include a few major programs. It doesn't include Social Security. It doesn't include Medicare. It doesn't include Medicaid. But almost everything else that the federal government does is here. So this is all of our federal spending on housing. It's federal spending on education. It's federal spending on running the government. It's federal spending on science research and public health, things that are very relevant for our security today. And all of those things, when you put them together, are dwarfed by our spending on the Pentagon and military. This is a typical chart, by the way. Year after year, this is really what it looks like, regardless of who's in power in Congress and who's in the White House. And I'll just note, in addition, we spend more than half of our discretionary budget on the military, but we spend another 10% on what we consider militarized spending here at home. So that includes things like immigration and customs enforcement, or ICE, border patrol, federal prisons, federal policing grants, and on and on. And when you take all of those things together, almost 2/3 of our federal budget is going towards militarized spending. And this is how we kind of get from having no budget to having that budget that I just showed you. There are two major pieces of legislation that set Pentagon funding. And so I'm going to start by talking about those and then back up a little bit to the bigger picture. So the first is, there are two parts, as I said. One is called an authorization and one is called an appropriation. And these are names that are not particularly clear about what they mean or what they do. But every year, Congress passes a National Defense Authorization Act. And what that is a piece of legislation that sets Pentagon policy and priorities, and it sets the total defense spending for the year, including the Pentagon, nuclear weapons, which are part of the Department of Energy, and some related law enforcement that's considered national security. And so that has to pass. And then there's a separate process, the appropriations process, that allows the Treasury to actually release those funds. And both of these things have to pass in order to fund the Department of Defense and our military. And so both of those also fit into our budget process overall. Now, this annual budget chart showing our process is just for the appropriations part of the process. And what it shows you is that over on the left, federal agencies submit their budgets to the administration, to the White House for review. And that's typically at the end of the calendar year. Then the president reviews those, the White House reviews those and submits the president's budget to Congress. The president's budget is due the first Monday in February, which did not happen this year. And in fact, frequently doesn't happen in the first year of a new administration and in other years. And then once the president has submitted their budget, roundabout in March, Congress can, the House starts to consider it, both houses are supposed to agree on something called a concurrent resolution. And what that is a very preliminary step that sets total government spending and is supposed to involve agreement from the House and the Senate. This frequently doesn't happen. And if you've been following news closely and trying to understand the very complicated reconciliation process that has been used recently to pass legislation for COVID, this is where that happens. Then if both houses do that, that's supposed to happen by April 15th, which is coming up very soon. That won't be happening this year. And then May 15th, the House of Representatives is supposed to begin the process by beginning their work on appropriations, and they're supposed to wrap that up by June 30th. And then the Senate is supposed to act. From there, the House and the Senate work out any differences they have, and the legislation, in theory, goes to the president down at the bottom to veto or sign into law. Now, it rarely works this way. All of this is supposed to be done by the beginning of the next fiscal year, which is October 1st. Here's what actually happened last year, which, even despite COVID, was actually a fairly typical year in terms of how the timing of the federal budget worked out. This is the way it's been relatively similar to this in many years recently. So February 10th, 2020, President Trump released his budget proposal. That was right on time. March, Congress began their appropriations process. That was right on time. In July, the markups of the bills began. That means that Congress started really hashing out the details of what was going to be in all of the appropriations bills. And then as of September 30th, they still haven't finished any of that work. And so they passed a continuing resolution, which means just that they kept the federal government open, operating at the same spending levels as they had authorized for the year before. And they made that last through December 11th to give themselves more time to negotiate a budget. And then from December 11th to December 27th of last year, Congress passed 4 additional extensions to give themselves more time to work on a budget. Finally, on December 23rd, they had passed the National Defense Authorization Act, one of the 2 pieces of legislation for the Pentagon that I talked about a couple of minutes ago. And Trump vetoed it. And he vetoed it because it included a requirement for the Pentagon to rename bases that were named after Confederate soldiers or Confederate fighters. So Trump vetoed it. And then on December 27th, Trump signed an omnibus appropriations for the fiscal year, which means one giant bill that funds the entire federal government. So at that point, all of the details had been worked out. The House and the Senate had passed it, and it was signed into law on December 27th. And then finally, on January 1st, Congress overrode the veto of the National Defense Authorization Act. So this is an almost year-long process. It went well past the end of the fiscal year on September 30th. And as I said, this is somewhat typical of how our federal budget process actually works these days. Now I'm going to talk about what's actually in those 2 pieces of legislation, the National Defense Authorization Act and the defense appropriations bills, and why our military spending is so over budgeted and so much more than we actually need. There are 3 kind of major reasons why the Pentagon budget is so much bigger than it has to be. One is a desire for global dominance and a false notion of what security means. Another is that the military is considered a jobs engine by many people in members of Congress. And a third, related to the second, but slightly different, is the military industrial complex, which is very efficient at promoting their products, not only to the Department of Defense, but to members of Congress. So this is just to show, when it comes to that first reason, sort of global dominance, this is just to show how dominant the United States is. Over on the left, the blue bar shows the United States military spending in 2019. The next bar shows the next 10 countries combined. And the US spent more than all of them put together in 2019. Again, this is completely typical. We spent more than twice as much as China, which is considered a major rival, and far, far more than Russia, which is considered another major rival. Then over on the far right, the green bar shows the entire rest of the world, 139 countries, whose military spending all put together doesn't even come close to what the US spends. This shows US military installations. So the US has 800 military installations all around the world. No other country has more than 20. So we're the only country that does this, that places our military everywhere at all times. And what we need to do is shift from this approach into more of a focus on peacekeeping and global economic equality. And that would actually resolve a lot of the problems that we have that make us think that we need to keep troops in these places. Another thing you'll see by the size of the circles where the biggest bases are. And the biggest bases that we have around the world are all in places where we fought wars in the 20th century and never left. So Japan, Korea, Italy, Germany, these are places where we maintain tens of thousands of troops at all times. And really the biggest reason why we're doing that is just because we started it and we never stopped. Now, this is related but different. This shows where we're fighting in the global war on terror, which back at the earlier slide where I showed all of our wars was the longest ongoing war. It started in 2001 and it has not yet ended. There are 80 countries where the United States is engaged in the global war on terror. And needless to say, not all of those countries have harbored terrorists that attacked the United States, and not any of them really pose a serious threat to the United States. So there are other reasons why we're doing this, of course. And the war on terror is incredibly costly. This is just a picture of an Iraqi family. And the global war on terror has left 800,000 people dead and displaced 37 million people from their homes. So it's contributing greatly to regional instability, making the world more dangerous instead of safer. And it's contributing to migration problems that are in turn exacerbating problems with authoritarianism and nationalism around the world in Europe and elsewhere. Now, when it comes to what the US is actually doing in all of these places, this is supposed to be one big example of what interests we're protecting. Of course, it's called the Department of Defense, and we talk about national security, but what are we actually keeping secure? So there was a study done a couple of years ago that estimated that the US spends $81 billion a year protecting global oil supplies. That should not be what we're doing to keep ourselves safe. We need to do just the opposite of that. So what we really need to do is stop defending the world's oil supplies, which don't belong to us anyway. And we need to, change to renewable energy so that we can deal with the climate crisis and stop perpetuating these wars and militarism all over the world to feed our addiction to fossil fuels. I'll just point out that the Pentagon itself is the largest institutional consumer of fossil fuels in the world and consumes more fossil fuel than many countries. Now, the second reason I talked about for why the spending goes as high as it does is that it's considered a job engine. And that is very much the case. If you ever go to Capitol Hill and talk to members of Congress or their staff about cutting military spending, you will frequently hear stories about how it is a job creator. But this is a really foolhardy choice to make, to use this military spending as a job creator. And that's because it doesn't create very many jobs compared to almost anything else that we could do with that money. So this chart shows you the job creation for a $230 billion annual investment, which was just chosen because it happened to be relevant for 1 year. So you can see all the way on the left, that first bar for war, that's how many jobs the United States created by spending $230 billion on war. The next bar is how many jobs we could have created by spending that same amount of money on clean energy. And then for infrastructure, healthcare, and education. All of these things create more jobs dollar for dollar than investment in the war and military. So the third thing I talked about is the military industrial complex. And as I said, this is very closely related to the second reason. It's not completely separate. But here is the budget for the Department of Defense in fiscal year 2019. And it's just broken into two pieces. It's based on the part of the budget that was spent for contracts, for for-profit contractors, lucrative military contracts for everything from jet fighters and bombs to catering and telecommunications. Over on the right, that blue segment. In 2019, the amount of contracts that the Department of Defense awarded was equal to 57% of the total budget. Only 43% of the total budget for the Department of Defense actually stayed in the Department of Defense. And an even smaller segment of that went toward pay and benefits for our troops. Only about 20% of the Department of Defense budget goes toward pay and benefits for our troops. So this is a huge moneymaker. Now, this is a screenshot, and not a very good quality one. Sorry about that, but a screenshot of an ad for the F-35 jet fighter, which is made by Lockheed Martin, and that's who ran the ad. And they have this nice Top Gun looking picture, and they've just laid it right out there: security and jobs for decades to come. Now, the F-35 jet fighter is supposed to cost over $1 trillion over the course of its lifetime. It has been plagued by hundreds of malfunctions and glitches and problems. And it costs, we spend about $10 to $11 billion every year buying new F-35s. This has been a tremendous controversy for years. But one of the biggest reasons that we don't disinvest from the F-35 is that second point on this ad: it's jobs. And so Lockheed Martin has been very clever about how they've distributed the money that they get for the F-35. There are parts of the F-35 manufactured in 46 states and in more than 300 congressional districts. So a lot of members of Congress have some real stake in keeping this program going, but it doesn't have to do with national security. And this is just a recent headline showing one of the many in a long series of problems with the F-35, which was one of our F-35 jet fighters shot itself. It literally shot itself. There's nothing more to say about that. So right now we have three major targets that we want to look at for Pentagon cuts. And I'm going to talk about how we can actually get there. One is the war fund known as the Overseas Contingency Operations Fund. And this has been used by the Pentagon and by Congress to stash more and more money into the Pentagon over the last 20 years. The second one is nuclear weapons. We are at a major turning point where we will either invest more in the next generation of nuclear weapons and nuclear weapons delivery systems, or we will cut back and we will go back to the New START treaty, which the Biden administration has already done, which limited nuclear weapons. We'll go back to treaties and go back to trying to reduce nuclear proliferation instead of investing in a whole new century of nuclear weaponization. And the third is contractors, which could include everything from the F-35 to contracts for maintenance services that are very lucrative for companies, but that could be done more efficiently by federal employees. So we've created a good bit of buzz over just the last year about cutting the Pentagon budget. And this is because there have been progressive movements and organizations working closely together to push toward a smaller Pentagon budget by working together in the same direction. Just a couple of weeks ago, there were 50 House Democrats who signed a letter to President Biden asking to significantly slash the Pentagon budget. This is not something that would have been possible even probably a year ago. But we need more. We need more than 50. Now, last year in July, we also had a vote in both the House and the Senate on cutting the Pentagon budget by 10%. And it didn't pass, but it did pretty well. It got more votes that year than a vote for 1% cuts had gotten previously. So we're making progress. And it was supported in the Senate by Senator Chuck Schumer, who of course is the Senate Democratic leader. And this is the kind of support that we need in order to make this a reality. Now, this is how you make it relevant as a state legislator in your own state, in your own part of your own state. These are just a few examples. If we cut the Pentagon budget, we can bring that money back home and pay for human needs and pay for things that we desperately need in our own communities. So these are examples of things we could have done during the COVID crisis that would have helped us make it through. So just 3 states out of 50, New York, Kentucky, and Wisconsin, and what they could have done in terms of unemployment checks or in terms of health insurance for their populations over the past year. And it's tremendous. It's a tremendous potential that is being wasted by throwing these billions of dollars into the Pentagon. Now, if you don't live in New York, Kentucky, or Wisconsin, and you want to see what that would look like for your own state, we have a calculator on our website that you can use to do that. And it's a really good tool when you're trying to make the local case for why to cut Pentagon spending. So our website is at www.nationalpriorities.org, and the calculator is in our data and tools section. And this is what it looks like. And you can choose your location down to your city or town or congressional district. And you can choose any number of different militarized programs and see if we shifted funding, what could we get instead? What could we get in terms of job creation, in terms of housing, in terms of education? There are more examples. So I would encourage you, if you go to make this case back at home or to your members of Congress, this is a really good tool to use to really make it feel very relevant to the conditions on the ground at home. And that's what we need to do. We need to make that case to make it relevant for the folks on the ground at home. And we can do that through a number of ways. We can do that through contacting members of Congress directly. You can certainly ask for a meeting. We can do it through running local op-eds. Any number of ways that you can use to communicate all of this will help us to build the case. And what we really need to be focusing on right now is building up that support so that we get more votes this year when we move forward to try another 10% Pentagon cut than we did last year. And it's not too soon to start right now. So from now until, we don't have a date yet, unfortunately, but sometime this summer, there'll be another vote for a Pentagon cut. And from now until then, that is the window that we have to really try to make a difference and get more votes this year than we did last year. So that is the end of my show, and
wow, thank you so much, Lindsay. That was, wow, just like you really laid that all out there, and it's crazy to see all of that data, especially compared to the state level. I'm gonna look, if anyone has any questions, be sure to add it to the Q&A or to the chat. Have one question from chat. What role do the budget, does the budget control agreement play in this year's budget?
Yeah, that's a really great question. So you're asking about the Budget Control Act, which passed in 2011. And if you remember all the talk back then about sequestration, that's what that was about. It was a law that was passed that would limit spending on both defense and non-defense discretionary spending for 10 years. And it set spending levels for those 10 years. Now Congress amended those spending levels over the years, so it didn't end up looking quite like the original legislation. But the Budget Control Act is expired now. This is going to be our first budget, the budget for fiscal year 2022, which is what is up for debate right now. It will be the first year that we have not had a Budget Control Act. And the way the Budget Control Act affected Pentagon spending in particular is that it set up a dynamic where folks who wanted to cut Pentagon spending had to negotiate in order to raise domestic spending because it had these two different spending caps for domestic and Pentagon spending. So, for example, you saw a lot of people on the far left, progressives in Congress, voting for higher Pentagon spending that they didn't support because it was the only way under the Budget Control Act to negotiate higher spending also for domestic spending. They had to kind of go up or come down together. Now that's not true anymore. So we have a real opportunity with that gone to really be more creative about what kind of support we can get for cutting Pentagon spending and how we can do it. Although I don't want to oversell that point too much. There is still a basic underlying dynamic where most on the right want more Pentagon spending and most on the left either kind of want it about where it is now or want it much smaller. And so there's still going to be some tension there for negotiating where it might be that Democrats would support higher Pentagon spending in part as part of a negotiation for higher domestic spending. So that dynamic's not completely gone, but the Budget Control Act does make it much less pervasive than it was before.
And just another question from me, and if anyone has any more questions, feel free to add them in the chat. Can you speak a bit about the partisan support on this issue?
Yeah. So unfortunately, so first of all, my project is a nonpartisan project, but generally speaking, unfortunately, high Pentagon spending has pretty much been a bipartisan affair. So it's, the National Defense Authorization Act, one of those two pieces of legislation I mentioned, has passed for 60 years running with bipartisan support. And I don't think there's another single thing probably in the federal government that you could say that about. So it's really a bipartisan problem. That said, most of the support for cutting Pentagon spending is on the left. So that letter from 50 House members to President Biden to cut the Pentagon budget, they were all Democrats. And the 93 House members who voted to cut Pentagon spending last year were also all Democrats. But so what we need to do more work though, because there aren't nearly enough Democrats or Republicans to get this done until we get more of them on our side.
Great. Well, there's no other questions. I want to say thank you so much, Lindsay. This was, like I said, always a pleasure to have you and the National Priorities Project as our partner with all this great data. And if anyone would like to watch this webinar again, it will be on our membership portal with all of our other webinars that we've done over the past year, from speech writing, social media, talking with journalists, and a whole host of other more topical issue-related webinars as well. So thank you, Lindsay, and thank you everyone for joining us, and I hope you have a great rest of your week. Thank you.
Thank you.